Lillian Carter had always known that her family's land was more than just soil and trees. It was a living legacy. It's a testament to the resilience of her grandmother, who had purchased the property during the Reconstruction era with the help of a small church community. At a time when opportunities for black families were deliberately limited, securing land was nothing short of revolutionary. For generations, the Carters used it for farming, gatherings, and as a safe place for the community to rest when the outside world offered little kindness. To Lillian, those 40 acres weren't simply property, they were sacred, the beating heart of her family's story. Every fence post and oak tree carried memories, and she considered herself more a steward of the land than its owner. As the town grew, so did the value of her inheritance. What was once seen as a forgotten stretch became prime real estate when a major highway expansion brought new businesses, subdivisions, and shopping centers within miles of her land. Developers quickly realized the potential profits, and it wasn't long before they came knocking on Lillian's door. Some came politely, with contracts and smiles, offering sums of money that would tempt most. Others were less subtle, hinting that she could either take the deal or be left behind as the town modernized. Each time Lillian shook her head, her response never wavered. "This land is not for sale." Her refusals, however, only seemed to fuel their determination. The developers were convinced that she would eventually crack under pressure. After all, she was just one woman living modestly on a farmhouse that needed repairs. While they had millions of dollars, lawyers, and influence on their side, they assumed her defiance was temporary, a stubborn front that would collapse once she saw the wealth she was missing out on. But what they misunderstood was that Lillian had never measured wealth in dollars. To her, wealth was having a place where her grandchildren could run free, where her ancestors rested undisturbed, and where no one could dictate the terms of her existence. When the first survey stakes appeared, Lillian thought there had been a mistake. Neon-colored flags popped up along her fence line, marking boundaries she knew didn't belong to anyone. But soon after, bulldozers rolled in, tearing into the earth with a violence that made her chest tighten. She marched down to the site and demanded to know what they thought they were doing. The construction manager, a man in a crisp white hard hat, barely glanced at her before dismissing her concerns. "This is private property, ma'am," he said with a smirk, "and you're trespassing." That moment burned into Lillian's memory, the arrogance in his voice, the way he looked at her as though she were an obstacle instead of a rightful landowner. She left without another word, but not because she was defeated. She knew something they did not. Every deed, every survey, and every title dating back more than a century rested safely in her home office. Months passed, and what had once been open fields transformed into a sprawling development. Streets were paved, houses went up, and soon families began moving into shiny new homes with manicured lawns. The developers and the Homeowners Association celebrated their progress marketing the neighborhood as a prestigious community with modern amenities. To them, it was a triumph. To Lillian, it was an invasion. She watched quietly from the edges of her property, her anger simmering beneath the surface. They thought she had been outmaneuvered, but in truth, she was letting them dig themselves deeper into the trap of their own arrogance. They believed they had taken her land. What they didn't realize was that every nail they hammered, every house they built, and every dollar they invested was on soil that still legally belonged to her. Lillian did not rush to court the moment she saw the first foundation being poured. She understood patience was her greatest weapon. The developers were arrogant, assuming she was powerless. They had no idea that every time she refused to sell, she had quietly prepared herself for the battle she knew would eventually come. Her grandmother had taught her the importance of keeping records, and over the years, Lillian had collected every deed, tax receipt, survey map, and notarized document related to her land. She stored them carefully in a fireproof safe, updated them whenever necessary, and even consulted a property attorney years before the first bulldozer arrived. To the developers, she was just an old woman standing in the way of progress. To Lillian, she was a guardian, holding the key to a storm they could never have imagined. When the 96th home was finally completed, the neighborhood celebrated with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor attended, smiling for cameras, praising the growth of the community. Lillian watched from a distance, her jaw set in determination. The moment was almost poetic to her. Every house that stood gleaming in the sun was not a defeat, but collateral for the legal war she was about to unleash. She waited until the neighborhood was filled with homeowners, till families had settled, until the HOA was fully organized and invested. Only then did she strike. One morning, a stack of official documents landed on the HOA president's desk. They were summons papers Lillian Carter versus the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association and Hamilton Developers, Inc. The claim was stunning. In its simplicity, the entire subdivision had been built on land that was not legally theirs. Attached were the deeds showing uninterrupted ownership in the Carter family for over a century. Not only had the developers failed to purchase the land, they had trespassed, stolen, and profited from property that was never for sale. The HOA board members laughed at first, assuming it was some kind of mistake. But after consulting their lawyers, the laughter turned into panic. Lillian's case wasn't flimsy, it was ironclad. In court, the judge listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments. The developers tried to argue that Lillian had abandoned the land, that she had allowed the construction to proceed without protest. But Lillian's lawyer calmly presented photographs, surveyor notes, and tax receipts proving she had maintained the property, paid every bill, and never once relinquished her rights. Her family's name was on every official record. The developers had no title transfer, no bill of sale, and no legal document granting them ownership. What they did have, however, were 96 homes built entirely on stolen soil. The ruling came swift and decisive. The land belonged to Lillian Carter. Every single home sat on her property, and the developers and HOA had no legal standing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief, but Lillian sat quietly, her face serene. She had known all along this day would come. The developers now faced a catastrophic choice. They could appeal, prolonging the inevitable, or they could negotiate with Lillian directly. The homeowners, terrified of losing their investments, begged the HOA to reach a settlement. Suddenly, the same people who had dismissed her as irrelevant were forced to acknowledge her as the most powerful figure in the community. Developers, who once offered her pennies on the dollar, now had to pay millions just to keep what they had already built. The HOA, which had sent her letters warning against trespassing near their homes, had to send representatives to her kitchen table humbly requesting terms. Lillian didn't gloat, nor did she rush to make demands. She listened, sipped her tea, and reminded them that she had warned every developer for years. The land was never for sale. In the end, Lillian structured the negotiations on her terms. The developers agreed to pay her a massive settlement, and the HOA was required to recognize her as the landowner with permanent authority over the community's use of the property. What they thought was their triumph became their downfall, all because they underestimated the power of a woman armed with patience, foresight, and an unbreakable connection to her family's legacy. As she walked across her land that evening, past rows of houses lit up with porch lights, Lillian smiled softly. They had built their dreams on her soil, but they had also built her victory. What they thought was a trap for her had, in truth, been her trap for them all along.